Congregation, we could turn our Bible again to Genesis chapter 4. And I'd like to read verses 8 through 10. Genesis 4, verses 8 through 10. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Well, congregation, today we have come to the sixth commandment, you shall not murder. And children, would you be surprised if I told you that there was a murderer in this room? Not just in this room, but in your pew. And you don't need to look beside you, because it's each of us. That might surprise you. We read this commandment every Sunday in the morning, you shall not murder, and it's maybe one that we think, okay, out of the 10, at least I haven't broken this one this week. I haven't killed anyone. And yet, if we're thinking that way, then we don't understand what this commandment is all about. Now, all of us, your pastor included, has broken this commandment. And so we need to come to this commandment and understand the scope of it, the spiritual nature of this command, that we might see our guilt before God and then go to Christ for cleansing. And as I said this morning, we want to do that in a little different way, and that is through the lens of a story. This well-known story, this sad and sickening story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. And one reason is then that, children, it maybe helps us follow along, but a second reason is that it illustrates that God's moral law was in existence before God recorded his moral law in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments didn't come into being at Mount Sinai. God's moral law is woven into nature itself, into creation. He made the world this way, to function in this way. And life works best for us when we do what God says in his moral law. It's a law that's binding upon all people in all places. And really, this law is a reflection of God's good, just, and holy character. And so it was binding from the beginning of time, as we see here in Genesis 4. Well, our title is My Brother's Keeper. My brother's keeper. That's coming, of course, from Cain's remark, his sinful remark back to God, but it's a fitting title for this commandment, my brother's keeper. First, we'll see the source of murder. Second, the sinfulness of murder. And finally, the solution for murderers. My brother's keeper, and first of all, the source of murder. Now, children, when we read this story in the Bible, we ought to be horrified. It should make our skin crawl a little. God records purposefully for us stories that aren't pleasant for us to hear. And he does so with a good intention, that we might see sin for what it really is, and that we might stay away from it at all costs. And so, children, many of you have siblings, you have brothers and sisters, and just realize what's happening in this passage. Here is a brother, Cain, and he is murdering, killing, shedding the blood of his brother. That ought to horrify us. That ought to scare us. And the question we need to ask then as we begin is, where does murder come from? What's the source of this? What happened to Cain that he got to this point? What moved him to kill his brother in cold blood? Now, young people, maybe you like reading murder mystery novels. They're exciting. You want to figure out, okay, who did it, right? Who's guilty in this novel? And so you try to piece together the clues. And as you read, you know that one thing that's true is that murder never starts with murder. Murder never starts with murder. No, there's always a trail leading up to murder. There's always these clues, these things, this progression, this buildup that gets to that boiling point, to that moment where one lashes out and kills another. And so as we approach our text, we need to have our detective hats on and look for the same thing. What's the source of murder here? And the first thing we see is that it's our evil desires. Our evil desires is the source of murder. Our text makes that very clear. You read in verse 5, so just to set the context, we notice how Cain and Abel have brought offerings to the Lord. And then verse 5, but the Lord did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. This is the first indication that Cain's on a treacherous path. It starts right here. The seeds are sown right here. He is very angry. And so, as I said, the source of murder is our evil desires. He's very angry. Now, it's not that all anger is bad. In fact, we read of Jesus being angry at a couple of points in the Gospels. One time, he was angry when his disciples didn't let the children come to him. He was furious. He was very angry. And that was right. That was good. That was holy and righteous anger. But this anger of Cain is very different. It's sinful anger. And if we're honest, the anger that we most often experience is Cain's type, not Christ's type. Most often, when we experience anger, it's sinful anger. Now, what is sinful anger? Kevin DeYoung, he's a pastor, he writes this. He says, sinful anger is anger directed at the wrong person, motivated by the wrong reasons, or out of proportion for the offenses. Sinful anger is anger directed at the wrong person, motivated by the wrong reasons, and it's out of proportion for the offenses that were committed. And we see that here in Cain. Notice who he's angry at. Who is the person that he's directing his anger at? You might think first it's Abel. But it's not actually Abel, first of all, that he's angry with. He is angry with God. He is furious that God has not accepted his offering. And so this is anger that's directed at the wrong person. He's filled with rage at this rejection, and that's shocking. We should be shocked by that. Cain has come, at least on the surface, to worship God. Cain is the one who is making an offering. And yet, as we read this story, we find that God rejects his worship, and now Cain, the worshiper, is steaming mad at the God he apparently came to worship. That's shocking. That tells us that it's possible for us to come to church and leave with hateful thoughts in our mind towards the God that we said we've come to worship. That's what's happening here with Cain. And the response of Cain reveals a lot. It actually reveals why God didn't accept his offering. Notice how Cain responds. It shows us that his heart was in the wrong place all along. God rejects his offering, and Cain responds in rage. That's a sign, that's an indicator his heart was not in the right place. If things were right in Cain's heart as he was approaching God in worship, and if God would have rejected his offering, Cain would have been broken in his heart. That would have been his response. He would have been showing contrition. He would have repented. He would have turned in faith. But instead of repentance, instead of faith, there's rage and there's fury. And it's giving us a window into the heart of this man. It's a sign of self-righteousness. The Lord, Cain thinks, must accept his offering. He deserves to be accepted. And so we get hints of Cain's heartless worship in verse 3. You read that there, it says, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. He brought an offering. But notice what's added in verse 4 when it describes Abel's offering. It says, Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and their fat, meaning the best of the best. So Cain brings an offering, but Abel brings the best that he can have, that he can supply. And that indicates where their hearts are at. In fact, Hebrews 11, verse 4 tells us that Abel presented his offering by faith. Faith was moving him, and so he was willing to give to the Lord the best that he had. But that wasn't the case with Cain. Cain didn't have faith. He was going through the motions, and so he offered this. He offered something, but it wasn't his best. There wasn't faith involved, and the Lord rejects his offering. And as is true of all hypocrites, Cain's anger is then lashed out at God. God, I deserve better. Why aren't you impressed? God's so demanding and never satisfied. Those are the thoughts of Cain. Those are the thoughts of a self-righteous person as well. And to make matters worse, God accepted Abel's offering. And so now Cain is not only angry at God, but he sees Abel's offering has been accepted, and so now envy is filling his heart and his mind. And in his mind, his brother has one-upped him, his younger brother. And again, children, we know what that is like, don't we? Maybe you and your siblings, you're asked to do something by your parents. You do it half-heartedly. You don't do your best. You know that. Your brother or sister does their best. Your parents are pleased with them. They're not pleased with you. And what happens inside? Anger. Maybe envy. Especially if it's a younger sibling. They've one-upped you. That's what's going on here with Cain. His blood is boiling. He's furious. Notice the text says, his face fell. You looked at Cain at this moment, and you could see anger written all over him. He's furious. And it's these evil desires that are the source of murder. That is, they are murder in seed form. If these seeds blossom, what's the fruit you're going to find? Well, it's the fruit we find in our text: death, murder. And so that's the warning to us. We hear the command, "You shall not murder," and we might think we're okay. We haven't committed physical murder. But our catechism, it states for us that God abhors the causes of murder, the sources of murder. He abhors things such as envy, hatred, anger, and desires of revenge, and he counts all of these things as murder. And our catechism then is just faithfully summarizing what Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 22. There he says, "I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause," so it's not righteous anger, "they shall be in danger of the judgment." And so how are we doing? Do we have any of these seeds of destruction waiting in our hearts like time bombs, just ticking, waiting to go off? Anger, envy, hatred, desires of revenge. Well, if we continue to nurture them, if we continue to water them, they will blossom into this bitter fruit of murder. So that's the first thing. The source of murder is our evil desires. But if we are the detectives at this crime scene, we actually need to go further. We need to follow the clues a little further. We actually haven't quite yet come to the source of the problem. We need to dig a little deeper, and that's where God takes us in verses 6 and 7. Notice, God graciously steps in. And isn't that gracious of God? Here is Cain, and he is fuming, he is boiling in anger at God, and God graciously steps in and he warns Cain to deal with his sin. God here is like a good father that comes up to Cain and he says, "Son, the direction you're going is deadly. Slow down, don't go down this path." And so here God, he could have struck Cain down for these angry, murderous thoughts against God, but God is patient. And he says in verse 6, "Why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, And those are the critical words I want to highlight. Sin lies at the door. Notice where God is shining his spotlight. It's directly onto Cain's heart. And so it's as if God is saying, Cain, be alert. I see your heart. I search you. I see your heart. I see this envy. I see this hatred. And it's only taking you in a bad direction. And so the ultimate source of murder is actually our own sinful hearts. Yes, our sinful desires, our evil desires, those are the seed form of murder. But the actual source of murder is not outside of us, but it's our own sinful hearts. God says sin lies at the door. And that word lie, it could actually better be translated as crouches. And so, children, the picture here is of a wild beast. Here's a lion. He's crouching. He's hungry. He's ready to pounce. And God is warning Cain, sin is crouching. It's crouching at your door. Now, maybe we've watched Planet Earth or other nature clips, and you know how it works. If a gazelle relaxes just for a moment, the lion pounces, and that's his lunch. That's the warning that Cain gets. Cain, if you relax a moment here spiritually, I see what's going on in your heart. If you relax for a moment here and take it easy and think that you can handle this, it's going to eat you. It's going to consume you. And so this is telling us, here's the point, it's that sin, the envy, the anger, the murder, these things aren't external to us. They are laced into our hearts by our fallen nature. They live within us. We have a lion living in us, ready to lash out. And this is our sin nature. We inherited this from our parents, from Adam. He was our covenant representative. God made Adam good and upright. But as soon as Adam ate that forbidden fruit, in the chapter before this, as soon as he ate that, something dramatic changed in his heart. He was poisoned. And instantly he was filled with this hatred for God and hatred for his neighbor. And we inherited that. Our hearts are evil by nature. Jesus tells us that. He says that in Mark chapter 7, verse 21. He says, "For from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts and murder." Do you hear that? Jesus is taking us to the source. It's inside. From within proceed evil thoughts and murder. So the picture is a sewage pipe. That's our natural heart. A sewage pipe. It's from within. Out of the heart of men proceed sewage. Evil thoughts and murder. Murder comes spewing forth from within us. We are murderers. We are born that way. Yes, that's original sin. And then in our foolishness, we act on this bitterness and hatred. And so the source of our murder is our own sinful hearts. We are the problem. We all have a killer instinct, as it were. Sin is at the door. Do you realize that? Sin is at the door. For some of us, we might not be realizing that. Some of us are playing safe with our sin. We're tempted today maybe to open the door to sin, just a little crack. I just want to give it, a little bit of room in my life. God is telling you this morning, don't do that. Sin is a wild beast. You cannot control sin. Sin will control you. Notice what he says to Cain. Its desire is for you. That's what Satan wants. He wants dominion over all of you, body and soul, and he wants to destroy you eternally. So don't give him an inch. If we give Satan a foothold, he busts open the door, and he will take our hearts. And so God is here warning us this morning. Don't go that way. Rule over your sin. Rule over your sin, Cain. And in that, Cain should have said, "But Lord, I can't. Help me. Help me, Lord. I need your grace." That's what Cain should have said. That's what we should say. Are you in the midst of temptation? Is Satan coming at you? Is sin like a beast at your door? What do you say in that moment? Lord, help me. Give me the grace to have the power to stand. Cain didn't say that, and we know how the story goes. Either Cain said, Lord, I don't need to worry about sin, or he said, I can handle this myself. And both of those responses are deadly. So here we've seen the source of murder. But second, let's see the sinfulness of murder. And our goal in this second point is to really see the vileness of murder so that we might better appreciate God's goodness in giving us the command, do not murder. That is a good thing. That's a good law. There's a gracious God standing behind this law. In order to see that, we need to see the vileness of murder. Notice verse 8. Now Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. And so, as the Bible often does, it records a shocking event with very little details and in such a matter-of-fact way. But we need to picture this. One day, Cain came up to his brother Abel, and it says that he talked to him. Maybe he said something like, brother, let's go into the field. I need your help with something. I need your opinion on this. I'm having trouble as I grow my grapes. Can you give me some advice? Here, come with me into the field. And so Abel follows Cain, goes with him, and he's unexpecting. And once they're in the field, suddenly Cain reaches down, grabs a rock, turns, and smashes Abel in the head. They didn't have weapons like we had today. You couldn't kill from a distance. This is bloody, this is gory, this is evil. Sin is evil. Sin is horrible. All sin is deadly. God wants us to see that. The anger in Cain's heart, that pent-up anger, it built up, it bubbled up, and suddenly it exploded, it erupted like a volcano. And he killed his brother. Notice that emphasis on brother. In verse 8, it says it 2 times. Whenever it says Abel, it says Abel his brother. Abel his brother. And actually 7 times in this chapter, it calls Abel Cain's brother. When Adam and Eve had a child, Abel, it doesn't say Adam and Eve had their son, Abel. It says Cain's brother. What's God's point? This is the closest human relationship. This is family here. These are blood ties. And yet look at what sin does. Look at where it takes you. Look at how far we go. We will kill those who are the closest in our lives. See sin, run from it. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Again, there's that emphasis, your brother. Where is Abel, your brother? God knows the answer to that. He's all-knowing. He's God. But he's coming here to Cain. Just like he came to Adam and Eve in the garden, God comes with a pointed question to convict of sin. God is giving Cain an opportunity to confess his sin. That's grace. As we go through here, all we're seeing is the grace of God as he's dealing with this wicked man. God comes with this pointed question to convict of sin. Where is Abel, your brother? And notice Cain's response. One sin leads to the next. He says, I don't know. He begins with a lie. And here's the point as well. Sin always breeds more sin. It's like bacteria. If you let children, if you maybe bring a food container to school and you let it sit in your locker for weeks and weeks and weeks, what's happening? Well, it's breeding more bacteria, more mold is growing in there. That's not going to clear up by itself. That's sin. Sin breeds more and more. It gets worse and worse and worse. We see that here. It takes Cain to a lie. And then it takes Cain a step further. Notice his retort. There's a bitter sneer in Cain's voice as he says, am I my brother's keeper? God, is this my job to be watching my brother 24 hours a day? So there's defiance in Cain. And as just on that thought, notice how sin breeds to sin. If you get through, this is why we read the whole chapter. Notice what Cain's children are like. You read of Lamech, and you hear Lamech boasting. You thought my dad was bad, my grandfather. You thought he was bad? I'm way worse. He's boasting about how he murders a man for hardly doing anything against him. Sin breeds sin. That's one of the points of this passage. But it's this sinful response, am I my brother's keeper, that actually takes us to the heart of what the sixth commandment is all about. Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer to that question is yes, Cain. Yes, you are. You ought to be. That's God's calling for us. And so what does keeper mean? What's this word mean? Well, this word keep, it's really the word to guard or to preserve. It's really the picture of a soldier guarding something, to watch over, to watch in a protectful way. A soldier is guarding a city on the walls. They're protecting the city. That's the idea here. This word is used in the psalm that we love to sing. We'll sing it later in the service. Psalm 121, Psalter 345. Right? The Lord, He who keeps you. And the Lord is your keeper. That's the same word. The Lord is our protective guardian, the one who watches over us. And so as image bearers, as those made in God's image, we are called to reflect Him. We're called to be our brother's keeper. That is, we're called to protect and to preserve the lives of those we come in contact with. And so that's what the sixth commandment calls us to protect and to promote human life. That's the sixth commandment in a nutshell, to protect and to promote human life. And there's a positive and a negative aspect to this. We'll start with the negative, that is what God forbids. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, we are called to be our brother's keeper. What's that mean? That means God says there's things we cannot do, we should not do, we must not do. Things that God forbids. And that's our catechism question 105. The answer is that neither in thoughts, nor words, nor gestures, much less in deeds, I dishonor, hate, wound, or kill my neighbor by myself or by another. I can't hire a hitman to do my dirty work. But that I lay aside all desire of revenge. Also that I hurt not my neighbor, but also myself, nor willfully expose myself to any danger. Wherefore also the magistrate is armed with the sword to prevent murder. And so we're called to act, we're never to act in a way that could harm ourselves and our neighbor without justification. And we add that without justification because everything we do in this fallen world comes with a risk. It comes with a harm. Everything. Every time we get in the car, there's a risk that we're taking for ourselves, for our passengers, for our neighbors as we drive by them. Everything we do in this world, it comes with a risk. And so we need to just be able to justify these risks in a right biblical way. We need to be able to say, these things are worth this risk. That's what God is calling us to. So it was risky, for example, for the Apostle Paul to go and preach the gospel in various places. And yet it was right for him in that instance to take that risk. And so question 105 says, I'm not to dishonor my neighbor. That's disrespect, discredit, to disgrace. And let's just think of ourselves. How are we doing? I'm not to hate them. I'm not to seek their destruction, to despise them. That's what hatred is, isn't it? I wish this person didn't exist. I wish I could get rid of this person. That's murder in seed form. We're not to injure, to wound or harm. We're not to kill our neighbor. And there that word means to unlawfully kill. The Bible gives us some lawful killings. Sometimes when it is lawful to kill. We think of capital punishment. That's what our catechism referred to, why the magistrate is armed with the sword. That's coming from Romans 13. The magistrate is armed with the sword to prevent murder. And so this is Genesis 9, verse 6. God, He has given us, as humanity, capital punishment. And so Christians ought to believe in careful capital punishment. That command in Genesis 9:6 has never been revoked. So that is the state. The civil magistrate is armed with the sword. But then there's also self-defense. You read through Exodus, and there's many instances of different case laws where if someone was breaking into your house and was threatening your life in self-defense, if you're just intending to preserve life, the life of yourself, the life of your family, and in doing so, you end up killing this murderer who's entered your house, you are innocent, God says. Now, you're never to exercise force that goes beyond what's required. If someone has come in to steal your laptop, you're not to shoot them. If they're threatening your family, that's a different story. That's what we read in Exodus. And then there's also just war. Soldiers are not guilty of murder if they're acting in just war. They're not automatically guilty of this command. And so our catechism, it tells us how we're to do this, how we do this by our thoughts. And again, we've talked about that. Murder originates in evil thoughts. But in words, through text messages maybe, through social media, through gossip, also in gestures, through body language. There's murder in our eyes. Maybe the response we give to our parents when they say something we don't like. And it doesn't just apply to others, as we've said, but also to our own selves. We're not to hurt ourselves nor willfully expose ourselves to danger. And so being my brother's keeper means that we don't do these things. God forbids these things. And that sounds like a lot. We should be convicted as we read that list. And yet, this command goes even further. It also tells us what God requires. It's not just enough to avoid certain things, but there's also a requirement. We are called to be our brother's keeper, a guardian of life. And so question 107, is it enough that we do not kill any man in the manner mentioned above? No, for when God forbids envy, hatred, and anger, He commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the summary. To love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the most basic test for us. We could flesh this out in many applications, but here is the test. Let's test ourselves. In every situation, am I treating this person as I would want to treat myself? And the Lord knows that built into us is something of self-preservation. We innately do things that generally speaking, now we are fallen and we are confused, but generally speaking, humans do things that promote their own interest. And God says, take that standard and ask that as you deal with your relationships. Am I doing something here that I would want them to do to me? And there's 3 ways we display this, our catechism says. The first is that we display the fruit of the Spirit. We show patience. Patience. There's long suffering here. We're not quick to respond. We show peace. We're not stirring up controversy for no cause. There's meekness, not being harsh, but we're meek. There's mercy. That is, there's pity. There's sympathy. There's understanding. We can come alongside someone and say, I understand what you're going through in a certain level. There's kindness towards him, not indifference. And so how we need this. Don't you see the goodness of this command? How we need this. How this changes our lives and our hearts as this is thriving in us and in our homes and the church and the school and society. God's commands are for our good. And our catechism goes on, it says not to prevent, or we are to prevent his hurt as much as in us lies. We're to try to preserve the lives of those around us as much as possible. And now it's critical that we have a holistic view of humanity. When we speak of protecting and promoting life, we're not just referring to physical life. We are referring to that. Christians should be concerned with physical life. Historically speaking, Christians have been behind medicine and hospitals. They've been the first ones to want to help and to come in and provide relief. But when we think of life, biblically speaking, we know that it's much bigger than physical health merely. It includes mental health, emotional health, social health, but also and especially spiritual health. There's such a thing as soul murder. Charles Spurgeon wrote a sermon with that title, Soul Murder. And this is what he said. There are other ways of being guilty of blood besides stabbing with a knife or poisoning with a deadly drug. There's another kind of murder far less detested by men, but equally black in God's sight, not the destruction of the body, but the destruction of the soul. Not the destruction of the mere shell, the outward man, but the murder of the real man, the inward self, the inward spirit, the soul murder, which cries for vengeance before high heaven. And so body and soul. That's always been the church's focus. That's our focus on the mission field. Word and deed. We bring the gospel to feed the soul, and we bring the deeds to feed the body. That's our focus. That should be the Christian's focus. We're concerned to love and to provide for every aspect of our neighbor, of our children, of ourselves. And our catechism concludes, it says, and to do good even to our enemies. Even to our enemies. Even like the Samaritan passing by, that stranger, the strange Jewish man who was murdered or was left for dead on the side of the road, even to our enemies. And so here we're seeing what God requires in this commandment. And as we see that, we see the sinfulness of murder. Instead of protecting and preserving life, we destroy life. We do the opposite. We reverse what our Creator commands us to do. And we do so by attacking a fellow image bearer. Thomas Watson, the Puritan, says, that's like tearing apart a picture of God. When we attack an image bearer, we are ripping up one of God's pictures. And so God hates murder. Verse 10, Cain, what have you done? What have you done? You hear the horror in the Lord's voice. He hates murder. The voice of your brother's blood, it cries out to me from the ground. The shedding of innocent blood, it does not go unnoticed by heaven. It rings in the Lord's ears, as it were. And so he punishes Cain. There's a curse pronounced upon him. And so for us then, as we think about our land, just think about the volume of the cries that are rising up to the Lord's ears at the bloodshed of innocent babies in the womb of mothers. Here is one murder, and God says, the blood is crying out to me. And we have a land that's soaked in murder and in blood. Do we hear the cries? Or have we grown accustomed to the genocide? This is a call for us, again, to seek to promote and preserve life. Well, we've seen the source and the sinfulness, but now finally the solution. We should all be convicted. I hope we're all convicted this morning. Each of us. As the Lord asks us, where is your brother? Where is your brother? We should be convicted as he searches us. But where do we go with our convictions? Is there a hope for murderers like us? Again, as we've been seeing the sad story, we've been saying there's the grace of God revealed here time and time again as he patiently deals with Cain, as he's calling him back, as he's dealing with him in mercy. And yet, Cain leaves the Lord. You read that in verse 16. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. What a terrible statement that is. He went out from the presence of the Lord. He wandered further and further from God, never to return. But see the depths of the grace of God then. See the Lord's grace as he's calling this wicked man back to himself. And so the Lord is here today calling us, every single one of us, no matter the type of murder we have committed, whether it's just in thoughts or actually in deeds with our hands. If that's the case, the Lord is calling murderers to himself, and we see that in the promise of the seed. You get to the end of the chapter, and it tells us that there's another family, and it's through the line of Seth. And God is preserving his family because there must be the seed, and that seed is Christ. This promise that he's given in Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman that would come and crush the serpent's head. The murderer from the beginning, as Jesus said, Satan himself will be crushed. And this Christ, how he suffered, how he was bruised, how he was forsaken, he was driven from the presence of the Lord, as it were. That's what we remember at this time of the year. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the answer is, for murderers, for sinners like you and I. That's why he was forsaken. So that unholy, murderous sinners might be welcomed back to the garden. that we might be brought back, that we might have access to live with God forever. Do you believe it? Do you believe that there is forgiveness for murderers? Scripture is clear. David, just think of David, the cold-blooded killer who hired Joab, his general, to murder Uriah. Even David, he could sing, "Blessed is the man whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." How he would sing that. The murderer, forgiven. And then there's the Apostle Paul. Acts 9 tells us, "Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, asked for letters from him to the synagogue of Damascus, so that if he found any who were on the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem." And what happens next? What happens to this murderer? Christ meets him. Christ meets him in his mercy. Christ saves him. Christ forgives him. And Christ changes his heart so that he might then love his neighbor. And so Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 1:15, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief." That's the message that the Lord wants us to leave with this morning. Christ Jesus came for this purpose, to save murderers like you and I. And so let's embrace him and receive the forgiveness that he has to give. Amen.